Hey guys, so I hope y'all are doing well. So what we're going to do is we're going to finish up the Renaissance, and we're going to talk about some of the Renaissance art and artists before we get into the Protestant Reformation. So if you will follow me along here, and let's talk about Renaissance art. So again, the Renaissance here produced new ideas that were reflected in the arts, philosophy, and literature. Medieval art, remember, so the medieval times are the Middle Ages. Their art and literature focused on the church and salvation. You got to remember, these people were in constant threat of being overtaken. In World History 1, you'll learn about something called feudalism, which was basically a social system that was set up where everybody had their own role in society, where you had your serfs, which lived and worked the land. You had your vassals and your knights who protected against barbarian invasions. So it was a very simple life. It was a very rough life. But it was the idea that you were constantly focused on the church and salvation. Even as awful as this life is going to be, your life, in eternity with Jesus will be much better. Whereas Renaissance art and literature focused on the individuals and worldly matters along with Christianity. So in the Renaissance, they were still Christian, but it's the idea, we're going back to this humanism. It's the idea that we are pushing the worth of individuals and basically the potential that humans have. Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was a painter, a sculptor, inventor, and a scientist. He was a true Renaissance man. And sometimes that term gets thrown out today. So if you're considered a Renaissance man, it means that you're very well cultured, very smart, and can really do about anything. So again, he sculpted, he painted, he even drew some of the early drawings he had were the prototype for the helicopter. Among his many masterpieces, Da Vinci painted one of the best-known portraits in the world, the Mona Lisa. It's a very mysterious painting that he did. A lot of people think he actually based that painting on his own mother. And then Leonardo da Vinci also produced a famous religious painting called The Last Supper. So again, we're talking about not only humanism and worldly events, but we're also talking about Christianity here. And of course, this is in the upper room when Jesus and his disciples are having their Last Supper. And, he talks about how he's getting ready to be crucified. It shows the personalities of Jesus' disciples through their facial expressions.
His name was Leonardo da Vinci. He was a painter, sculptor, architect, engineer, and scientist. And he had one of the finest minds of his century. Leonardo was born in 1452 in the town of Vinci in northern Italy. By the age of 15, he had moved with his father to Florence, a city of great culture where the Renaissance was in full bloom. The Renaissance was a revival of art and learning in Europe not seen since the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans. It was characterized by a thirst for knowledge of all kinds and a desire to explore the possibilities of human achievement. True to these ideals, Leonardo studied astronomy, anatomy, botany, and geology. Today we know him best as the painter of the Mona Lisa, but he was also an inventor. His notebooks contained plans for hundreds of machines that were far ahead of their time. Ships, planes, and weapons of war dreamed of hundreds of years before science would create the materials necessary to build them. Leonardo opened a studio in Florence in his late 20s. His drawings from this time period include inventions of farm tools, pumps, and weaving machines. He drew amazingly accurate sketches of human body parts and their functions. A left-hander, Leonardo sometimes wrote backwards. This can be read with a mirror.
Michelangelo Buonarroti. Some people say Michelangelo. He was an Italian sculptor, a painter, an architect, a poet, and an engineer of the Renaissance who had a great influence on the development of Western art. Michelangelo was brilliant, but he wasn't a very nice person. He was rude. His nose was permanently displaced because he'd been in so many fights it had been broken. He didn't take a lot of baths. He slept in his clothes. So he was kind of a weird individual, but very brilliant. One of Michelangelo's most famous works was a 17-foot tall sculpture of the most famous Hebrew king David. So again, Christianity, we're talking about the story of David and Goliath. But look at David. You can actually even see here, I don't know if you can follow my mouse here, just look at the veins that are in his arms. Look how strong he is. And then there's another picture here I'll show you. Look at look how big his hands are. So again, very, very brilliant sculpture here. Michelangelo also painted scenes from the book of Genesis on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So it talks about from, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to Noah. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome. Petrarch. Francesco Petrarch was an Italian scholar and poet in Renaissance Italy. He was one of the earliest humanists. And Petrarch rediscovered Cicero's letters, and he is often called the father of humanism because of his scholarship. Niccolo Machiavelli. He was an Italian Renaissance politician, humanist, and writer. Machiavelli wrote something called The Prince, which was his greatest work. It was an early modern treatise on government. Basically, the idea that the best type of government is to have absolute rule, and that's what he supported. And of course, the whole thing about the absolute power is the idea that, there's an old saying about a means to an end. So you know what? If I have to lie, if I have to cheat, if I have to steal, then that's okay. Right now, we've got a presidential election coming up, and some of the states are actually talking about going to mail-in ballots. And so the people who are really against that are saying, well, you know what? There's a way you can cheat, because you really don't have to verify these ballots, whereas most people, when you go to a polling place, you have to show a photo ID, you have to show some type of proof that you are who you are. But if you can cheat, and so those people who, let's say you really don't like Donald Trump, well, they'll say, well, you know what, the end justifies the means. Even if we got to cheat because Donald Trump is such a bad president, or if people were to cheat for Joe Biden, they might say, well, you know what, I know we cheated, but you know what? Joe Biden would be such a terrible president that even though we cheated and even though we did things a little underhandedly, the benefit, the end result is we're going to have a better leader than if we were to allow just things to happen normally. Erasmus. So Desiderius Erasmus intellectually reconciled humanism and Christianity. So again, it's this idea that we can take Christianity, but we're not just focusing on the church and salvation. We can also implement that with human growth and potential in our humanism. His book, The Praise of Folly, in 1511, poked fun at greedy merchants, heartsick lovers, and quarrelsome scholars, and pompous priests. Erasmus believed in a Christianity of the heart, not of ceremony and rules, and believed that all people should read the Bible. Accomplishments in literature, Shakespeare. William Shakespeare, arguably the greatest playwright of all time, also wrote in Renaissance England. And all English teachers, I'm sure you've had a lot of exposure to William Shakespeare. He wrote sonnets, plays, and essays. And his most famous plays included the tragedies of Macbeth, King Lear, Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, and the comedy A Midsummer Night's Dream. But again, all these were tragedies. So usually something bad happened in these plays that Shakespeare was known for.
William Shakespeare, one of the greatest authors of all time, was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, England. His actual birth date is uncertain, but most scholars believe he was born on or near April 23, 1564.
We think he may have been educated in the King's School at Stratford because that would have been typical for a child with a father who was an alderman. What we do know is that he didn't go to university.
We have a marriage record for Shakespeare to Anne Hathaway in 1585. We also have baptism records for a daughter and a set of twins. And we also know that his son, Hamnet, one of the twins, died.
Shakespeare moved to London in the late 1580s. By the early 1590s, we know he's writing, and we know that he's acting.
By 1597, Shakespeare had authored 15 of the 37 plays attributed to him, including Romeo and Juliet, Comedy of Errors, and The Merry Wives of Windsor.
People think of William Shakespeare as an artist, a playwright. He was a pretty good businessman.
In 1599, he built the largest open-air amphitheater in London, the Globe Theatre.
He was an entrepreneur, he knew his market, he knew how to cater to that market, he made shrewd real estate investments.
Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, changed its name to the King's Men when King James became its patron in 1603. This was a mark of exceptional prestige.
The different types of Shakespeare plays, they're separated into histories, comedies, tragedies, and then later on tragicomedies.
Shakespeare's phrases, the ways he used words, are so common that people often get mixed up and can't remember if they came from the Bible or from Shakespeare. My grandmother used to say, when something bad happened, that these were the slings and arrows of everyday life. She was not an educated woman, and she didn't go to Shakespeare plays. She didn't get that one from the Bible.
What scholars call Shakespeare's middle period, from 1595 to 1605, included such classic comedies as Midsummer Night's Dream, As You Like It, Twelfth Night, and Much Ado About Nothing. He also produced Hamlet, Othello, and Macbeth during this period.
Right at the cusp where Shakespeare begins to write Lear, it tips into what we could call the later Shakespeare. And this period produces Lear, Antony and Cleopatra, Tempest, Winter's Tale, Pericles, Cymbeline.
Shakespeare wrote great stories. For example, one of the stories starts with a king who is tired, he doesn't want to govern anymore, so he says to his three daughters, I'm going to separate the kingdom between the three of you, but it's going to be based on who tells me how much they love me. However much you love me, that's how much of the kingdom you're going to get. Now that's going to make me sit up. I mean, what a way to start a story. And that's King Lear.
Shakespeare was not only a playwright, he also was a poet, partly because of economic necessity. During the early 1590s, plague closed the theaters in London, and there was quite a vogue for producing sonnets.
Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets, in addition to several narrative poems.
Shakespeare worked the English language, milked it for all it was worth, made up words if it didn't give him the right words. He is one of the first professional writers.
The details of William Shakespeare's death remain a mystery, but scholars believe he died on his birthday, April 23, 1616. In the 400 years since, Shakespeare's influence has only grown. His writing is the second most quoted after the Bible. He has been credited with introducing almost 3,000 words to the English language, and a Google search on Shakespeare returns more than 140 million results.
Shakespeare talked about the human condition. He explains to us how we think, how we feel, the human psyche. He eloquently explains it.
In the 18th century, questions arose about the authorship of Shakespeare's work, given the vague details we know of his life, his lack of higher education, and the similarity of his plays to others of the day. Today, most scholars believe Shakespeare wrote all his plays and sonnets.
I would argue that Shakespeare's legacy is the most influential figure in human civilization.
All right, guys, so that finishes up the Renaissance. We're going to take a little Ed puzzle quiz and then start on the Protestant Reformation.